The day Ruth Callahan's world cracked open like dry summer earth was the same day a stranger rode into Colter's Creek with nothing but a worn saddle, a quiet horse, and eyes that had seen too much of the world to pretend it was ever simple. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Colter's Creek sat low in the valley of southwestern Kansas, half buried in red dust and broken promises. The Santa Fe Trail had long since stitched itself through the landscape, and the cattle drives that followed kept the town breathing, though barely. There were days the wind came in from the south so hot and relentless that the women pressed wet cloths to their necks, and the men sat in the shade of the livery stable arguing about rain that never came. The railroad had pushed through 100 miles east, and with it had gone some of the town's ambition, leaving behind a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, a saloon that served tolerable whiskey, and a scattering of homesteads pushing up from the grassland like stubborn weeds. Ruth Callahan was 28 years old, and she had the kind of beauty that hardship makes deeper rather than diminishes. Her dark hair was almost always pinned up beneath a calico bonnet, and her hands were rough from the work of keeping a small farm alive. But her brown eyes were soft and watchful and full of a warmth that people couldn't help but lean toward, the way flowers lean toward whatever light they can find. She had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas Callahan, had died of a fever that swept through the valley in the winter of 1876, leaving her with 3 children, a leaking roof, 40 acres of half-planted land, and a debt at Harmon's General Store that seemed to grow larger no matter how many eggs she sold or how many shirts she mended for the other families in town. Her children were everything to her. Clara was 8 years old, serious and careful, already helping her mother hang laundry and stir soup pots with the gravity of a much older child. Henry was 6, all knees and elbows and laughter, forever chasing the chickens around the yard and inventing adventures that invariably ended with torn trouser knees. And then there was little Sam. Samuel James Callahan was 3 years old, and he was the image of his father in every way that mattered, with the same round cheeks, the same gap-toothed smile that appeared slowly and completely, like sunrise. Sam was the one Ruth rocked longest at night. Sam was the one she pressed her face into when the grief got too wide to hold upright. She managed. Women in 1878 Kansas had to manage because there was no other word for what they did. They did not thrive, they did not rest, they managed. Ruth rose before the sun and went to bed long after it had set. She milked the cow, she tended the kitchen garden. She mended and cooked and bargained and prayed with the practical faith of a woman who had learned that God answered prayers mostly through the agency of her own 2 hands. The morning Jedediah Bishop rode into Colter's Creek, Ruth was at the general store. She had come with 6 dozen eggs carefully packed in straw inside a wooden crate that Henry had helped her load into the wagon, and she had 3 mended shirts belonging to Frank Dyer the blacksmith. And she had the $2.40 she had been saving for 6 weeks to put toward the store debt. She had little Sam on her hip and Clara at her side, because Henry had been left at home with strict instructions to feed the chickens, and not under any circumstances go near the creek. Cyrus Harmon, who ran the general store, was not an unkind man, but he was a careful one, the way men become careful when they have watched too many homesteaders fail. He took Ruth's eggs and counted out their value against the debt with a methodical slowness that made Ruth's jaw tight. He acknowledged the mended shirts. He accepted the $2.40, and then he told her, with genuine regret laid thin over practical firmness, that the balance remaining was $9.70, and that he could not continue extending credit past the month of June. It was the 14th of May. Ruth stood very straight. She thanked him. She took Sam more firmly onto her hip and took Clara's hand and walked out of the store into the bright Kansas morning with her chin up and her throat burning with something she refused to call despair. She was standing at the edge of the porch, settling Sam against her side and trying to calculate, for the 100th time, how $9.70 might be earned in 6 weeks with the resources she had, when she heard the slow clop of hooves on the main street and looked up. Jedediah Bishop rode a bay horse with a white blaze down its nose and a calm way of moving that matched its rider. The man himself was lean and tall in the saddle, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it met the collar of a trail-worn shirt. He wore a hat that had been quality once, the brim rolled up on one side, and he had the look of a man who had been traveling long enough that arriving somewhere, even a small dust-blown town like Colter's Creek, was a kind of relief he didn't let himself show too openly. He passed the general store without looking her way. Ruth watched him go with the idle observation of a woman with too much on her mind to invest real attention in a passing stranger, and then she turned back to her calculations. She walked to the wagon, settled Sam into the bed of it on the folded quilt she always brought for him, and helped Clara up onto the seat beside her. She picked up the reins. $9.70. 6 weeks. She had 2 acres of kitchen garden that might bring something at market by mid-June if the weather held. She could take in more mending. She could ask Ada Fenwick if the school needed help with anything, since Ada's husband ran the schoolhouse and sometimes paid women to help prepare materials. She could sell the second cow, but that would mean no butter to sell and no milk for the children through the summer, which was a solution that ate itself. She clicked to the mare and started home. She was halfway down the main street when Sam, who had been investigating the corner of the wagon bed with the intense focus of a 3-year-old scientist, stood up suddenly, leaned over the side rail and lost his hat. It was a small hat, a soft brown thing she had made herself from a piece of wool blanket, and it fell directly into the street. Sam made a sound of profound tragedy. "Mama, hat. I see it, sweet pea." Ruth pulled the mare to a stop and was climbing down from the wagon when a man's voice came from behind her. "I've got it, ma'am." She turned. The man on the bay horse had circled back and was already dismounting in a single fluid motion, moving with the ease of someone who had spent the better part of his life getting on and off horses. He picked up Sam's hat from the dust, knocked it against his knee to clean it, and held it up toward the wagon where Sam was still peering over the rail with enormous eyes. "There you go, young man," he said, and his voice was low and warm, with a drawl that placed him somewhere south, maybe Texas or Oklahoma territory. "No hat left behind." Sam stared at him with the frank, unblinking assessment only small children and old women seem capable of. "Thank you," Ruth said. She reached for the hat, and he handed it to her. Their eyes met properly for the first time. His were a pale gray-green that surprised her, the color of creek water in winter, and there was a steadiness in them that she noticed without meaning to. He was not handsome in the easy, uncomplicated way of men who know they are handsome. His face had been weathered and lived in. There was a scar along the jaw on the left side and the beginning of lines at the corners of his eyes, but there was something honest in it, something that made her feel, absurdly, that this was a face she could trust. "Jedediah Bishop," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Ruth Callahan," she said, and then, because she was Ruth and warmth was simply how she moved through the world, "have you just arrived in Colter's Creek?" "About an hour ago," he said. "Come through from Dodge City, looking for work." "There's a ranch north of town," she said. "The Craddock spread. Emmett Craddock usually needs hands this time of year for the spring drives." He nodded, and there was something in the way he received this information, not eager, not dismissive, just accepting, that told her he was a man who had knocked on a lot of doors in his life and had learned to knock without expectation. "Much obliged," he said. Sam, who had grown bored of watching the adults and had located a fascinating piece of dried grass in the wagon bed, suddenly held it up toward the stranger with the grave generosity of a child presenting a gift. Jedediah Bishop looked at the piece of dried grass in the small offered hand, and something moved briefly across his face, something soft and private and quickly contained. He reached up and accepted the grass as though it were a worthy gift. "Thank you kindly," he said to Sam, with a seriousness that made the little boy light up. Ruth almost smiled. She did smile a little. She could not help it. "Good luck at the Craddock Ranch," she said, and climbed back up onto the wagon seat. She drove home with the wind at her back, and Sam singing something tuneless in the wagon bed, and Clara reading aloud from the primer she had carried along. And Ruth thought about $9.70 and the 14th of June, and did not think at all about the man with the Winter Creek eyes, except that she thought about him quite a lot, which she told herself was simply the idle observation of a mind seeking distraction. Emmett Craddock was a big, square-jawed man who had built his ranch through sheer, relentless stubbornness, starting with nothing but a mule and a plot of land in 1865, and growing it slowly over 13 years into something that other men in the valley respected if not entirely loved. He took one look at Jedediah Bishop, asked him 3 questions about cattle and trail experience, watched him handle a horse for approximately 2 minutes, and hired him on the spot at $30 a month plus board. Jedediah was not a man who talked much about himself, but he was a man who worked. The other hands at the Craddock Ranch, a rough-edged collection of cowboys named Pete Haverford, Cobb McCready, and a young man who went only by Dutchy, recognized this within the first week. Jedediah could work a full day and still have energy for the evening tasks. He could read cattle, and read trouble before either of the other 2 announced themselves. He was quiet in a way that was not unfriendly, but he kept a distance between himself and the world that the other men respected without understanding. He had come from Texas, which was true enough, but the longer story was more complicated and more painful, and Jedediah kept it packed down deep where it could not do much harm. He had spent 8 years working cattle drives up through Indian Territory and into Kansas. He had been to Abilene and Wichita and Dodge City, and had seen what those towns did to men who did not have something worth holding onto, and he had come very close to being one of those men more than once. He was 32 years old and had, by his own private accounting, very little to show for any of it except the ability to do a hard day's work and keep himself from drinking more than was wise. He had not planned to stay in Colter's Creek any longer than it took to earn enough to move on. That had been his plan in the last 3 towns too. He came into town for the first time on a Saturday, which was when most of the ranch hands rode in to collect supplies and visit the saloon and do whatever it was men did when they had been working in the same small stretch of land all week. He had a list from Emmett Craddock for supplies from the general store and his own need for a new pair of bootlaces, and he had no particular interest in the saloon. He was coming out of Harmon's general store with a wrapped parcel of supplies under one arm when he heard the sound of a child crying. Not the sharp, startled cry of a child who had fallen, but the sustained, exhausted cry of a child who was tired and overwhelmed, and it was coming from the side of the building. He went around the corner and found Ruth Callahan sitting on the bottom step of the store's side entrance with little Sam in her lap, and Sam was crying with the whole-body conviction of a 3-year-old who has exceeded his capacity for patience, and Ruth was rubbing circles on his back and speaking to him in a low, steady voice that was doing its level best not to sound as strained as it was. Clara stood a little apart with her hands folded, watching her mother with the careful worry that had become, Ruth knew, too habitual a look for an 8-year-old. Henry was not there, which meant she had left him with the neighbor woman today. Jedediah stopped. He was aware that a man walking away was probably the appropriate thing to do. A woman managing her children in a difficult moment did not need an audience. But he also recognized something in Ruth Callahan's face in that unguarded instant, something that he recognized because he had seen it in a mirror enough times, the expression of a person holding something very heavy and running out of space to hold it. He did not walk away. Instead, he crouched down to be at Sam's level, just slightly out of the child's direct line of sight, and made a small, surprising sound, a kind of low, gentle warble that was not quite a bird call and not quite a whistle. And Sam, with the perfect distractionability of his age, stopped crying mid-sob and looked over at him with a hiccuping confusion. "Well," Jedediah said gravely, "I did not expect to find a young man of such distinction sitting out here without his hat." Sam did have his hat on, in fact. This seemed to confuse him further. "I do have my hat," Sam said, his voice thick with recent tears. "Well, so you do," Jedediah said with great solemnity. "My mistake." "That makes considerably more sense then." Sam looked at him for a long moment and then, with the inexplicable emotional velocity of small children, began to show the faintest precursor of a smile. Ruth stared at this man, this stranger she had met once in the street and had told herself she had not thought about, and felt something shift behind her sternum that she did not know what to do with. "Mr. Bishop," she said. He looked up at her. "Mrs. Callahan." And then, because he was not a man who ignored what was plainly visible, "Are you all right?" "Perfectly fine," she said in the tone of voice that means the exact opposite, and they both knew it, and then unexpectedly she laughed a little. It was a short, tired laugh, but a real one. "No, we had a difficult morning. Is there something I can do?" "We are fine," she said more gently this time. "Thank you." He nodded, stood, adjusted the parcel under his arm. But he didn't leave immediately. He looked at Sam, who was watching him with wet eyes and the beginning of renewed interest. "You know what I think, young man," he said to Sam. "What?" said Sam. "I think you are going to have a better afternoon than morning. I have found that is generally how it goes." Sam considered this philosophical proposition with the gravity it deserved. "Why?" "Because the morning is behind you," Jedediah said simply, "and the afternoon is still ahead. Things ahead always have the chance to be better." Ruth watched him say this and felt the words land in her chest somewhere, not because they were profound exactly, but because he said them with such plain, quiet conviction, as though he had tested this belief himself and found it to be generally reliable. He touched his hat to her and went back around the corner to his horse. Clara came and stood beside her mother and watched the space where the man had gone. "Who is that?" she asked. "A cowboy," Ruth said. "He works at the Craddock Ranch." "He made Sam stop crying," Clara observed, with the analytical accuracy of an 8-year-old. "He did," Ruth agreed. She sat there in the Kansas morning with Sam growing heavy and calm in her lap and thought about the afternoon being better than the morning, and was surprised to find that she believed it. She began to see him around town after that. Colter's Creek was not a large place, and on Saturdays it became even smaller, since everyone came in from the outlying homesteads and ranches to do their trading and visiting. She saw him at the feed store talking to old Vernon Gray, who supplied half the county. She saw him at the church on a Sunday morning, which surprised her, sitting in the back row with his hat in his hands, listening to Reverend Aldous Pitt deliver a sermon about persistence with the patient attention of a man who had heard hard things said in gentler ways before. She saw him help a woman she didn't recognize get a loaded wagon out of a rut in the main street on a wet afternoon, giving his coat to her to protect her dress from the mud while he worked, and then handing it back as though lending his coat to strangers in need was simply a thing a man did. She was not watching him, she told herself. She simply noticed these things because the town was small and she was observant. It was Ada Fenwick who introduced them properly, in the way that small-town women have always arranged these introductions, with the plausible deniability of coincidence. Ada had Ruth over for supper one evening at the end of May on the pretext of discussing the church's upcoming summer social, and it happened that Ada's husband Wallace had invited the newer Craddock Ranch hand along as well, since Wallace Fenwick believed firmly that new men in town ought to be invited into the community rather than left to find the saloon as their primary social institution. Ruth arrived at Ada's neat white house with her 3 children to find Jedediah Bishop already there, sitting in the parlor with his long legs stretched out before him, engaged in a conversation with Wallace about the spring cattle market in Wichita. He stood when she came in, as a man did, and she saw the slight adjustment of his expression, the brief, controlled warmth, as though he were pleased to see her but had practiced not showing it too readily. They sat at supper across from each other, while the children occupied the children's places at the end of the table, and Ada's own two small children competed with them for the bread rolls. It was a civilized chaos, and the conversation moved from the cattle market to the coming summer, from the summer to the question of the railroad and what it meant for small towns like theirs, and from there to the wider world in the halting, imperfect way of people who are accustomed to life at a local scale, and know that the wider world is both more interesting and more threatening than immediate experience. She learned things about him through the meal in the way you learn things about people across a supper table, in glimpses, in asides, in the way a person responds to other people's stories. He had grown up in eastern Texas, near a small town called Palestine. His father had been a farmer, not a rancher, and it had been a lean life. He had gone north with the first big cattle drives in the early 1870s and had simply not stopped going north. He had a sister in Texas still, and he wrote her letters, though he admitted with a self-deprecating rueful quality that he was not a reliable correspondent. He asked Ruth about the farm, and she told him honestly about it, the 40 acres, the kitchen garden, the difficulty of making a small operation work without a second pair of adult hands. She watched him listen. He listened the way some people do, as though listening were itself an act of respect. "Thomas," she said at one point and paused. "My husband passed 14 months ago." He met her eyes. There was no performance of sympathy, no hollow expression of condolence that people sometimes offer to fill the silence. He just held her gaze and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Callahan. That's a hard road." "Yes," she said, and somehow that simplicity, that plain acknowledgement without decoration, was more comforting than most of the elaborate sympathies she had received in the months following Thomas's death. After supper, while Ada and Ruth washed the dishes and the men went out to the porch, and the children ran in the side yard in the last of the evening light, Ruth heard Sam's voice very clearly through the open window, announcing to the yard at large that he could jump over the entire fence. And then she heard Jedediah's voice, calm and warm, saying that it was a very impressive fence, and he thought perhaps starting with something slightly smaller might be a wise first step. Ada, washing a pot beside her, smiled at Ruth with a look that was too knowing to be accidental. "He is a good man," Ada said, with the careful casualness of a woman who has arranged a supper table very precisely. "Ada," Ruth said. "I am simply making an observation," Ada said serenely, and handed her a wet dish to dry. Ruth drove home that night in the warm May dark with Clara asleep against her shoulder and Henry asleep in the wagon bed and Sam still awake, looking up at the stars with the concentrated expression of someone memorizing them for later. She thought about the way the evening had been, the ease of it, how ordinary it had felt to sit across a table from a man and have a real conversation, how strange it was that ordinary could feel so unfamiliar. She told herself to be sensible. She had 3 children and a debt and 40 acres and enough actual difficulty to occupy all of her practical attention, without adding the complication of noticing a man's pale gray-green eyes or the particular quietness of his voice when he spoke to her youngest child. The practical difficulties proceeded to reassert themselves almost immediately. In the first week of June, the section of the barn roof she had been watching warily all spring finally gave in to its own deterioration, and a night of hard rain came through the hole and soaked the hay she had been storing for the summer. The second week of June brought a late frost that damaged a third of the kitchen garden. She looked at the numbers again and saw that June 14th was going to arrive before she could cover the remaining debt, and that Cyrus Harmon, who was a practical man, would have to make a practical decision. She was in the garden on a Tuesday afternoon, assessing the damage from the frost with the focused grimness of a general surveying a battlefield, when she heard a horse come up the path. She turned, and Jedediah Bishop rode in on his bay horse. She was surprised enough that she stood there for a moment with a trowel in her hand and dirt on her apron without saying anything. "Afternoon, Mrs. Callahan," he said, dismounting with that characteristic ease. "Mr. Bishop," she said. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing wrong," he said. "I've got a free afternoon. Emmett Craddock gave the hands the day since we've been putting in long weeks." He looked at the garden, at the drooping frost-damaged plants. "I heard about the frost. Thought I might see if there was anything useful I could do." She looked at him. She was a proud woman in the particular way of people who have had to learn that accepting help is different from admitting defeat, though the line between those two things was still not always clear to her. "The barn roof," she said finally. "There is a section that is in a sorry state." He looked at the barn, then at her. "I know a little about roofing." She almost said that he did not have to do that, and she could hear herself saying it and also hear how foolish it was, because the roof needed to be done and she could not afford a carpenter, and this man was offering freely. "There are shingles in the barn," she said. "Thomas put them aside." He nodded. He tied his horse at the post and went to the barn and came back with the shingles and the tools, and he spent the remainder of the afternoon on the roof. Ruth brought him water twice, and then supper when the children needed feeding, and she stood at the foot of the barn and watched him work with the instinctive competence of someone who had learned a great many practical skills by necessity. Henry came and stood beside her, watching with the open-mouthed admiration of a 6-year-old observing a man do something difficult. "Is he our friend?" Henry asked. "He is being very neighborly," Ruth said carefully. Henry considered this. "I think he is our friend," he decided, and went to investigate whether the horses would tolerate a small boy near them. Jedediah stayed for supper. Ruth had not planned for company, but she had made a good pot of beans with salt pork and there was cornbread, and he ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had been living on ranch house cooking, which was generally functional rather than excellent. He complimented the cornbread, and she could tell he meant it. At supper, Sam spent the meal watching him across the table with a level, assessing look that was entirely his own, and then, toward the end, climbed down from his chair and went around to stand beside Jedediah with the purposefulness of a small person who had made a decision. "You can come again," Sam announced. Jedediah looked down at him with the slow smile that Ruth had now seen enough times to recognize, the one that started at the corners of his mouth and took its time. "Well, I appreciate that invitation, Sam," Ruth said, though she was not entirely displeased. "He fixed the roof," Sam said, with the unassailable logic of a 3-year-old. Jedediah caught Ruth's eye across the table, and she found that she was biting the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing, and he looked as though he was doing the same. He helped her wash the dishes after supper, which was so unexpected a gesture that she did not know how to object to it before it was already happening. They stood at the wash basin together while the children went out to catch fireflies in the early summer evening, and the domesticity of it, the ordinary normalness, was overwhelming in a way she had not anticipated. "You do not have to do all of this," she said quietly. "I know," he said just as quietly. He was drying a plate, looking at it rather than at her. "I wanted to be useful." She looked at his profile, the line of his jaw, the way he held himself with that particular self-contained quality that was not coldness but was rather the opposite of carelessness. "Why?" she asked. He set the plate down and looked at her then, and there was something open in his expression that she suspected he did not often let people see. "Because you are clearly managing something that most people couldn't manage," he said, "and because I have been in a good many places and passed through a good many lives, and there is very little I have found that is worth the time you put into it. But this is." He gestured briefly at the kitchen, the evening sounds outside, the children's voices. "Whatever this is. This matters." Ruth stood very still with her hands in the dishwater. He seemed to realize he had said more than he intended. He looked away and picked up the drying cloth again. "I apologize," he said. "That was forward." "No," she said, and her voice was a little unsteady. "It was honest." They finished the dishes and he took his leave, and Ruth watched him ride away in the summer dark, and she stood at the fence for a long time after the sound of hooves had faded, and she pressed her hands over the fence rail and breathed the evening air and acknowledged, for the first time without flinching, that she was in a very considerable amount of trouble. The June 14th deadline came, and went in a way that was both worse and better than she had feared. She went to Harmon's with what she had, which was $7.20, and she stood across the counter from Cyrus Harmon and explained her situation clearly and without embellishment. Harmon looked at the ledger for a long time. He told her he could give her another 3 weeks, through July 4th, because she had been reliable and honest, and because he was not, at bottom, a man who could look a widow with 3 children in the eye and put a deadline to their survival without his conscience making complaints. She thanked him with more dignity than relief showing, though both were present, and walked out into the sun, and immediately thought of Jedediah Bishop and how she wanted to tell him, because he was, she realized, the person she most wanted to tell. She thought about this on the walk to the wagon, and then all the way home, and then through the supper preparation, and she went asleep that night thinking about it and woke the next morning with the same thought and the beginning of a clear, somewhat terrifying understanding of what was happening to her. She did not seek him out. She was not that kind of woman, or at least she had not been before. But the following Saturday she was at the general store and he was there too, and they walked out of the store at the same time into the bright morning, and he fell into step beside her toward the wagon as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Harmon gave me until July 4th, she told him, because she had wanted to tell him, and there he was. He absorbed this. That's good, he said. Do you have a plan for the difference? I have several plans, she said. I am not entirely sure any of them are adequate. Tell me, she told him. The kitchen garden, the mending, the possibility of the school. He listened and then said, with the directness she had come to expect from him, your garden is going to be your best return. The frost hit the front sections, but the back plot looked all right when I was there last week. If you get those crops to market before the end of June, even at modest prices, you should be close. I know, she said. The problem is getting everything harvested and to market in time. It is a great deal of work for one person. He was quiet for a moment. My Sundays are my own, he said, and any evening I am not needed for a late drive. She stopped walking and looked at him. Jedediah, she said, and his name felt like something she had permission to use now, which was its own kind of threshold. You cannot give your free time to my farm indefinitely. You have your own life. I am aware of that, he said, and there was a quality in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite gravity, but somewhere between. I am also aware of what I choose to do with my time, and I would rather spend a Sunday helping your garden get to market than spend it playing cards at the saloon. She held his gaze for a long moment. Why? She asked, and it was the same question she had asked at the dishwater, and they both knew it. This time he did not look away. Because I would rather spend it with you, he said. The street of Colter's Creek was very ordinary and very bright around them, and a wagon went past with a creak, and Vernon Gray's dog barked at something, and the world continued its business. Ruth Callahan stood on the unpainted boardwalk in front of Harmon's general store and looked at Jedediah Bishop, and felt the whole architecture of her careful, practical management of herself shifting its foundations. I have 3 children, she said. I know, he said. I have sat across your supper table from them. I like your children, Ruth. And it was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed exactly as such things do. This is very sudden, she said, though she was not sure it was, or whether what felt sudden was simply the moment of acknowledging something that had been building in both directions for weeks. I can wait, he said simply. I am not in a hurry. I just wanted to be honest with you about where I stand so you know. She nodded slowly. That is, she said, a very reasonable thing. I am known on occasion for reason, he said, and the faintest trace of wry warmth moved through his voice, which was becoming familiar to her now. recognizable from a distance the way a particular bird song is, once you have heard it enough. She drove home that afternoon thinking about what it was to be honest with someone, and about how long it had been since she had let herself want something that was not purely practical or for the children's benefit, and about how strange and tender and terrifying it was that such a wanting had announced itself so quietly and now refused to be quiet at all. He came on Sunday. He came in the evenings when he could. He came and helped her harvest the kitchen garden in the last week of June, working beside her in the warm evening light, while Clara helped sort vegetables, and Henry dragged the bushel baskets to the wagon, and Sam sat importantly on a fence rail, and declared himself the supervisor of operations. They loaded the wagon and took the produce to the Saturday market on the first day of July, and Ruth stood at her stall through the long hot morning and sold vegetables with the concentrated persuasion of a woman with a very specific goal. And Jedediah stood at the wagon and unloaded and reloaded, and told anyone who slowed down to consider passing by that Mrs. Callahan's produce was the finest in the county, which made Ruth bite her lip against a smile. By the end of the market, she had earned $6.80. Between that and what she had been able to save from mending, she went to Harmon's on the morning of July 3rd and paid the remaining debt in full, down to the last cent. Harmon shook her hand and said he was glad to see it settled, and there was genuine respect in the way he said it. She walked outside and stood in the July sun and breathed. Jedediah was waiting by the wagon, knowing, she realized, that she would come out wearing whatever the outcome looked like on her face. He read her face. "Clear?" he asked. "Clear," she said. He did not whoop or clap her on the back or make a production of it. He looked at her with that quiet, steady regard, and the warmth in it was so plain and so unguarded that she felt it like something physical, like stepping from shadow into sunlight. "Congratulations," he said. "I could not have done it without your help," she said. "You could have," he said with perfect sincerity. "It would have been harder and taken longer, but you would have found a way. You always do." She looked at him standing in the July sun against the wagon, this man who had ridden into her town with nothing but a quiet horse and Winter Creek eyes, and she thought about how the afternoon was always better than the morning, and she thought, yes. They began, in the careful, deliberate way of two people who have both had reasons to be careful, to become more openly what they had been quietly becoming for weeks. He drove her and the children home from church on Sundays and stayed for noon dinner. She began saving the best of whatever she was baking and leaving a portion of it with a note at the Craddock Ranch when she was in that direction, because she could not think of another way to say that she was thinking of him without actually saying it. And the notes that came back from the Craddock Ranch in a handwriting that was careful and unornate and precise made her read them twice in the kitchen before she folded them into her apron pocket and went about her day. The notes were practical on the surface. They said things like, "The bread was excellent, and I think the rain will hold off another week, which is good for your garden, and Henry told me he wants to learn to rope." She wrote back with equal practicality, saying that the bread had been a new attempt with molasses, and she was glad it had worked, and that she thought Henry learning to rope was a fine idea as long as he promised not to rope the chickens. He wrote back that he could make no such assurance on Henry's behalf, but would do his best to steer the boy toward more appropriate targets. She kept every note. Henry did learn to rope. Jedediah spent 3 Sunday afternoons in August teaching Henry, with a patience that never frayed, and Henry took to it with a ferocity of purpose that impressed even Jedediah. Clara, who had remained slightly more reserved in her assessment of this man who was becoming such a regular presence in their life, came one afternoon and asked very seriously if he would teach her too. He looked at her with a gravity that matched hers, said that roping was an excellent skill for anyone regardless of their disposition toward cattle, and taught her with the same patience he had given Henry. Sam, who was 3 and could not rope but was not willing to be left out of anything, was given his own small loop of rope and permitted to practice swinging it at a fence post, which he did with tremendous enthusiasm and modest accuracy. Ruth watched all of this from the porch and felt something in her that had been very tightly wounded for a very long time beginning, with great care and deliberateness, to loosen. They talked in the evenings when the children were in bed, sitting on the porch in the late summer warmth with the Kansas stars enormous overhead and the insects singing in the grass. He told her more about Texas, about his sister Margaret, about the cattle drives and what they had been like in the early days of them, the dust and the distance, and the particular loneliness of moving through an enormous landscape without a fixed point to return to. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about coming west with Thomas in 1872 when they were young and the territory was full of possibility, and neither of them had fully understood what the word hardship would require of them. "Were you happy?" he asked once, meaning with Thomas, and she considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Yes," she said. "Not always easily, but yes, we were happy. He was a good man and we built something together that I am proud of even now." She paused. "I do not feel guilty for being here talking to you. I want you to know that. I have said goodbye to Thomas in my heart, in the way that you have to, in order to keep living." He was quiet for a moment. "I never had a marriage," he said. "I came close once, in Abilene years ago, but she was wiser than I was about what my life actually looked like at the time, and she was right to make the decision she did." "Were you hurt?" she asked. "Yes," he said without drama. "And then I understood why, and I was grateful to her for her honesty." He looked at the stars. "I think I needed some years after that to become someone worth spending a life with." The plainness of this, the self-aware humility of it, moved her so much she could not immediately speak. "Do you feel," she said carefully, "that you are there now, someone worth spending a life with?" He turned and looked at her in the starlight, and his expression was the most fully open she had ever seen it, as though he had decided, with full intention, to set down all the careful distances he normally kept. "I think I am getting there," he said, "and I think you are a very significant reason why." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that in the Kansas night for a long time without either of them needing to say anything more. The Craddock Ranch required a drive north in September, and Jedediah was gone for 3 weeks. The weeks were long in a way that they had not been long before, which told her more than any amount of reasoning had managed to. The children noticed too. Henry asked when Jed was coming back on approximately every other day. Clara mentioned it in passing with the careful casualness she had developed for masking her feelings, which she clearly came by honestly. Even Sam asked for him, in the particular way of very small children who have decided someone is part of the fabric of their world and are unsettled by the absence. He came back on a Thursday afternoon in late September, and Ruth was in the kitchen when she heard his horse on the path, and she did something she had not allowed herself to do before. She went to the door and stood in it, and waited for him with no pretense that she had happened to be standing there for any other reason. He saw her in the door from 30 yards out, and she saw his face change, saw the slow arrival of that particular smile, and he rode to the hitching post and dismounted and said, "Hello, Ruth," in a voice that was quiet and warm and contained something so much larger than the words. "Hello, Jedediah," she said, and stepped off the porch to meet him. They stood in the yard in the September afternoon, and neither of them seemed to know exactly what to do with the magnitude of being glad to see each other. And then he did a simple, unhurried thing. He took off his hat and held it in one hand and reached out with the other and tucked a strand of her hair that the wind had blown loose back behind her ear, and she stood very still while he did it, and the gentleness of it nearly undid her. "I missed you," she said, because she was Ruth and she had learned that honesty was worth more than self-protection. "I thought about you every single day," he said, and his voice was entirely steady and entirely sincere. He stayed for supper, which turned into staying the evening, and at the end of the evening he asked, in the deliberate, formal, slightly nervous way of a man who has prepared himself for this and is still finding it difficult, whether she might consider allowing him to court her officially properly, with the intention of a serious future. She looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough for him to look uncertain, and then she said, "Jedediah Bishop, I have been allowing that for 3 months." He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and she realized she had rarely heard him laugh like that, and that she wanted very much to hear it as often as possible for the rest of her life. He spoke to Clara first. This was something Ruth had not asked of him, and something he did entirely of his own accord, coming to Clara one Saturday afternoon, while Ruth was inside and sitting down on the porch steps with her, and having a conversation that Ruth could hear in pieces through the open window, and that made her press her hand against her mouth. He told Clara that he thought very highly of her mother, and that he was hoping if her mother would agree to be a permanent part of their family, but that he knew that was a large and important thing, and that he wanted Clara to know that her thoughts mattered. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My papa died." "I know," he said. "I know he did, and I know that he loved you very much, and I would never ask you to forget him or pretend he was not real." "He built the barn," Clara said. "He built a very good barn," Jedediah said. "I can tell by how it went back together." Another silence. "Then are you going to leave?" "No," he said, and the word was simple and absolute and required nothing added to it. Clara thought about this for a while. Then she said, "All right," in the tone of a person who has conducted a fair assessment and reached a reasonable conclusion. He spoke to Henry too, who responded with an immediate and uncomplicated enthusiasm that was entirely characteristic, and with Sam, who responded by climbing into his lap and going to sleep, which seemed to Jedediah to constitute a favorable reception. On the first day of October, 1878, on the porch of her farmhouse in the late afternoon, with the prairie grass going gold in every direction, and the sky that particular enormous Kansas blue, Ruth Callahan said yes to Jedediah Bishop in response to a question he asked with his hat in his hands, and his gray-green eyes very clear and very steady, and she said it with her whole heart. They were married on the 15th of November, 1878, in the Colter's Creek Church with the leaning steeple, with Reverend Aldous Pitt presiding and Ada and Wallace Fenwick as witnesses, and the children in their best clothes. Clara with a ribbon in her hair and Henry with his hair aggressively and unsuccessfully flattened, and Sam in the small suit Ruth had made him, wearing his hat, because she had not been able to convince him to leave it on the bench. The church was full because the town of Colter's Creek, whatever its limitations, understood that occasions of genuine joy were scarce enough to be celebrated properly. People came who barely knew them, and people came who had watched Ruth manage alone for 14 months, and were quietly glad to see her not alone anymore. Jedediah's hands were perfectly steady when he put the ring on her finger. Ruth looked up at him in the candlelight of the church on that November afternoon, in the high-collared dress she had made from good blue wool with Ada's help, and thought about how the world had been so narrow and so heavy in May, and how much had changed, and how the best things could arrive without announcement, on a quiet horse, with Winter Creek eyes. When Reverend Pitt said Jedediah could kiss his bride, Jedediah cupped Ruth's face in both hands and kissed her with a tenderness so complete and so unhurried that several of the older women in the pews pressed their handkerchiefs to their eyes, and Ada Fenwick looked at Wallace Fenwick with the expression of a woman who has arranged things exactly as they should be arranged. In the front pew, Sam, who had been very well behaved throughout the ceremony and had therefore earned himself an extraordinary surplus of patience, stood on the pew seat to see better and announced in a voice that carried to the back of the church, "Mama got kissed." The laughter from the congregation broke the tender solemnity in exactly the right way, and Ruth laughed too with her hands on Jedediah's chest and her face lit up, and Jedediah laughed with his arms around her, and it was, by any measure, a very good beginning. There was a celebration at the Fenwick house after, because Ada had organized it with the same quiet, comprehensive efficiency with which she organized everything. There was food and fiddle music and dancing on the wide plank floor, and Ruth danced with Jedediah while the children watched from the edges, and later she danced with Henry, who was extremely serious about the dancing despite having no particular aptitude for it, and Jedediah danced with Clara, who was graceful and precise, and wore the expression of someone carefully concealing the fact that she was enjoying herself very much. Sam fell asleep in the corner on a pile of coats at precisely 8:30 in the evening, which was later than anyone had expected him to last. Jedediah carried him home. He carried Sam in against his chest, the small body heavy and warm with sleep, and Ruth walked beside him in the November dark with the cold stars very bright overhead, and she looked at this man who was her husband now, carrying her youngest child with such easy, natural care, and felt something settle in her that had been waiting a long time to settle. She reached out and took his arm as they walked, and he looked at her sideways with that quiet warmth, and she leaned against him slightly, and they walked home through the dark Kansas night, and the world was very good. Jedediah moved his things from the Craddock Ranch bunkhouse and into the farmhouse, and the practical adjustments of a new marriage proceeded with the mixture of grace and adjustment that is always required when a life is being rebuilt into a new shape. He kept his work at the Craddock Ranch through the winter, because his wage, combined with Ruth's various income sources, made the farm genuinely sustainable for the first time since Thomas had died. He came home in the evenings to supper and children and Ruth, and the contrast with the years of coming back to bunkhouses and trail camps was so stark that he sometimes stood in the doorway for a moment before going in, simply to take stock of the fact that this was real. He was handy. Thomas had been a good man but not particularly skilled with construction, and there were things throughout the farm that Jedediah, with the accumulated practical knowledge of a man who had spent 15 years figuring out how to fix things with what was available, could address. He repaired the fence line that had been held together largely by optimism. He reinforced the chicken coop against the winter wind. He rebuilt the stone chimney of the root cellar, which had been threatening to crumble for 2 seasons. Henry followed him through all of this with the dedication of a disciple. Henry was 6 years old, and Jedediah was the most interesting person who had ever entered his life, and he conveyed this assessment without any self-consciousness whatsoever. He handed tools, he held boards, he asked questions in rapid succession without always waiting for the answers. He fell down from things and got up and fell down again. Jedediah answered every question with the same steady patience, and when Henry fell down, he waited to see if getting up was within his own capacity before offering assistance. Ruth watched this and felt a gratitude so large she sometimes did not know how to contain it. Clara, for her part, thawed slowly and completely. It took until January, when she got a cold that went to her chest and kept her home from school for 10 days, and Jedediah sat with her in the evenings and read to her from whatever books the household had, and played cards with her when she was well enough to sit up, and on the 3rd night brought an illustrated newspaper that he had gotten from Dodge City on a supply run, and read her the stories about far-off places. By the time she was well enough to go back to school, Clara had arrived at the private conclusion that Jedediah Bishop was, in fact, exactly what she had hoped for without being willing to admit she had hoped for anything. Sam simply loved him. Sam's love was immediate and absolute and entirely uncomplicated, the love of a small child for someone safe and warm and present, and Jedediah received it with a gentleness that Ruth found, every time she witnessed it, almost unbearable in the best way. It was in February of 1879, on a quiet Sunday afternoon with the snow coming down outside and the children occupied in the front room and the house warm from the stove, that Ruth told Jedediah she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, quietly, watching his face. He went very still. Then the slow sunrise smile arrived, and he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with the careful, encompassing care of someone holding something precious, and pressed his face into her hair and said her name once, very quietly. "Jedediah," she said, because she needed to say it. "This is the best thing," he said against her hair. "This is the very best thing." He was so completely certain of it that she could feel the certainty through his arms around her, and she thought about all the careful practical management she had done for so long, the holding together and the barely managing and the keeping of chins up, and she thought, "It is all right now. It is all right." The spring thaw came in March of 1879, with a rush and a softness that made the whole valley smell of wet earth and new grass, and with it came a development that shook the town of Colter's Creek briefly and seriously. Emmett Craddock announced that he was selling the northern section of his ranch to a land company out of Chicago, which meant that 5 of his 8 hands would no longer be needed. Jedediah was not among the 5 let go. Emmett valued him too much for that. But the news rippled through the community with the unsettling efficiency of all economic disruptions, reminding everyone how quickly the ground could shift. It was during this period that a question that Jedediah had been quietly turning over for months became more pressing. What was his future? Working for wages at the Craddock Ranch was stable enough for now, but it was not a foundation. He had a wife, 3 children, another on the way. He needed something more durable than a hired hand's position at a ranch that was itself being parceled and sold. He talked to Ruth about it on a March evening with the first real warmth in the air. They sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and he spread out the figures he had been working on, and they sat together and looked at the numbers the way people look at problems together when they are genuinely on the same side. The 40 acres of Ruth's farm were good land, underutilized, because she had not had the capital or the labor to develop them fully. But with his wage saved from the past winter and his previous savings, and with what the farm itself could return if properly developed, there was a possible path. He had been talking to a man named Orrin Mabry, who had a small cattle operation southwest of town, about learning the specifics of a smaller-scale operation that was self-sustaining rather than dependent on a large ranch's seasonal needs. Ruth listened to all of this with the focused attention she gave to anything that mattered, asking questions that were precise and practical. And at the end she said, "What would you need to make the beginning of this work?" he told her. It was not an impossible amount, it was a stretch, but she had been stretching for years and she knew how to calculate a stretch. "Let us do it," she said. He looked at her across the table. "You trust this plan?" "I trust you," she said, "and the plan is sensible, and I would rather build something together than maintain something by myself indefinitely." She put her hand flat on the table between them. "We build this together." He put his hand over hers. "Together," he said. It took the spring and summer and into the fall, but they built it. He reduced his hours at the Craddock Ranch to part-time by July and spent the rest of his time developing the southern section of the 40 acres for grazing. He bought 6 head of cattle in May, grew to 12 by October. Ruth expanded the kitchen garden and began selling produce at a real scale, not just the survival-level subsistence she had managed before, but a genuine market operation that supplied 2 of the town's regular customers. Henry, 7 now, worked beside him in the evenings with a focused enthusiasm that was beginning to look less like a child playing and more like a person genuinely learning something. In the middle of all of this building, on a warm August morning in 1879, their son was born. He came into the world with an immediate and vociferous announcement of his presence, and Ruth, who had done this 3 times before and knew what to expect, laughed between contractions with a joy that startled the midwife, who was used to tears. He was a large, healthy boy with Jedediah's coloring and Ruth's mouth, and they named him Elias Thomas Bishop, the middle name a deliberate honoring that Jedediah had suggested himself. Jedediah held his son for the first time in the afternoon of the day he was born, sitting in the chair beside the bed with the baby wrapped in the quilt Ruth's mother had made. and he was very still and very quiet for a long time. Ruth watched him from the bed, tired and tender and completely happy. "He is something," Jedediah said finally, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "He is," she agreed. He looked up at her, and she could see in his face everything that he was not quite saying, the depth of what this meant to a man who had spent 15 years moving through the world without a fixed point, and she reached out her hand, and he took it without looking away from her, and that was enough. Sam, upon being introduced to his new brother, observed him for a full minute with the expression of a scientist encountering a new and interesting specimen, and then announced that Elias was very small and that he himself had presumably also been this small, which was hard to believe. Henry wanted immediately to know when Elias would be big enough to ride a horse. Clara held him with the careful, competent tenderness of a 10-year-old who had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for something to take care of. The winter of 1879 was hard, as Kansas winters were, but the farmhouse was warmer than it had ever been, and there was enough laid in for the cold months, and the 4 children were healthy and loud, and filling the house to its edges. Ruth and Jedediah lay in bed in the winter nights listening to the wind and the sleeping sounds of the house, and talked the way people do when they have time and warmth and each other, and the urgency of survival has eased enough to allow for something more expansive. He told her things he had not told anyone. She told him things she had not said aloud since Thomas. They were not always easy conversations. Some of them were about loss and fear, and the particular vulnerabilities that people carry when they have been alone for long stretches, but they were honest, and between them honesty had always been the most important currency. "I used to think," he said one night in January, with the snow making the world outside perfectly silent, "that my life was something that happened to me rather than something I was building. Like I was following the trail wherever it led and not much choosing the direction. And now," she asked. He turned his head to look at her in the dark. "Now I choose every single day," he said, "and I choose this, you, them, this house, this place. I choose it with everything I have." She reached across and touched his face in the dark, and he covered her hand with his, and they were quiet together in the good dark of a winter night, and the world outside was cold and the world inside was warm. By the spring of 1880, the farm had a name. It had been Ruth's idea, which Jedediah had received with the immediate, simple approval of a man who recognized a right thing when he heard it. They called it the Bishop Callahan Place, a hyphenated name that was unusual enough in that part of Kansas to draw comment, but which felt exactly right to both of them, because it honored what had come before and what was being built now equally. The cattle herd had grown to 20 head, which was not a large operation but was a real one, a sustainable one, the kind that could be grown carefully over years. The kitchen garden had become, with the help of a steady supply of labor from Henry and occasional assistance from Dutchy, who had left the Craddock Ranch and could sometimes be hired for a day's work, something that generated a genuine income through the summer market season. Jedediah had ended his employment at the Craddock Ranch entirely by April, and Emmett Craddock, who was a man who respected competence in whatever form it took, had said goodbye with something that approached genuine warmth and told him the door was open if he ever needed it. Ruth looked at the farm in the spring of 1880 and then at Jedediah, standing at the fence watching the cattle in the new green grass, and she thought about the morning she had walked out of Harmon's General Store with the debt hanging over her and the future looking very narrow, and about how much space the world had turned out to have in it when the right person stood beside you in it. It was that same spring, a Sunday afternoon at the end of April, that the moment that Ruth would tell about for the rest of her life occurred, the moment that she would replay when she needed to understand something about the nature of generosity and goodness, and the quiet way that love announces itself in the smallest things before you understand what the announcement means. Jedediah had ridden into town that morning for supplies, and when he returned, he did not come alone. He came with Pete Haverford, the former Craddock hand who had been let go in the reduction and who had been having a difficult winter of it, riding the line between work and not enough work with a worn-down quality that Jedediah had noticed and Ruth had noticed, and neither of them had known quite what to do about yet. Pete had his 12-year-old daughter with him, a girl named Willa who was quiet and watchful, and Pete had come to ask, with considerable dignity and visible difficulty, whether there was any work available at the Bishop Callahan farm, because he was in need of steady employment and Jedediah Bishop was the man he trusted most to treat him fairly. Jedediah brought him in and they talked over the noon meal, and Ruth fed Willa cornbread and listened to the men talk through the practical questions with the honest, straightforward manner that she had come to love about Jedediah's approach to things, and they came to an arrangement before the afternoon was done. A fair arrangement, work for a fair wage, with the possibility of growing into something more permanent if the operation continued to expand. But what stayed with Ruth, the moment that she held onto and kept, happened when Pete and Willa were preparing to leave and walk back to town, because Pete's horse had thrown a shoe and Jedediah had sent it to the farrier. Sam, who was now 4.5 and had become, over the winter, a person of very strong opinions about everything, had been circling Willa all afternoon with the protective curiosity of a small boy who suspects a girl his size might be interesting to know. They were all standing in the yard, the horses being readied, the goodbyes being said, and Sam went over to Jedediah and tugged his sleeve and said, in his serious Sam way, "Papa." He had been calling him Papa since January. It had happened without ceremony, simply the day that Papa was the word that fit. Jedediah crouched down to his level. "What is it, young man?" Sam looked at Willa, standing a little apart with her hands folded, watching the preparations with a still, contained quality that Ruth recognized as the expression of a child who has learned not to ask for things. "She looks sad," Sam said, with the plain, direct observation of a 4-year-old. Jedediah looked at Willa for a moment. Then he looked at Sam. And then he did something that Ruth saw from across the yard and that stopped her breath completely. He reached into the pocket of his vest and took out a coin. It was a silver Liberty-seated dime, worn from much handling, and Ruth would learn later that it had been the last coin in his pocket, literally the last one, since he had spent the rest of his money on the supplies in town. He held it out and put it into Sam's small hand, and he curled Sam's fingers around it, and he said in a voice low enough that Ruth had to be still to hear it across the yard, "Go give that to her. Tell her it's for good luck." Sam looked at the coin in his hand with great solemnity. Then he crossed the yard with the purposeful dignity of a small person on an important mission and went up to Willa and held out the coin and said, with complete seriousness, "This is for good luck." Willa looked at the coin and then at Sam and then at Jedediah, with the eyes of a child who has received something unexpected and does not know where to put it. "Thank you," she whispered. Sam nodded, satisfied, and went back to stand near Jedediah, who put a hand briefly on the top of his head. Pete Haverford, who had seen this, looked at Jedediah with an expression that was beyond gratitude, the expression of a man who has been seen and treated with dignity at a moment when his daughter needed it most. Ruth watched Jedediah in that moment, watched the whole small, unremarkable, enormous transaction of it, this man who had ridden in with nothing and had given everything freely, and who now stood in the yard of the farm they were building together with her youngest child at his knee, and she felt such a fierce and consuming love for him that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. She watched him go. She watched him turn from Willa and walk back toward the house where she stood, walking with the loose-limbed ease that was entirely his own, and he looked up and saw her watching him, and he read something in her face as he always could, and his expression shifted into that quiet, particular warmth. He came to her and she put her hands on his chest and looked up at him and said, "That was the last coin you had." He looked briefly, endearingly, embarrassed. "The supplies were more expensive than I calculated." "Jedediah, she needed it more," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. "You are," she said, "the best man I have ever known." He shook his head with the slight discomfort of a man unused to being called the best of anything. "I am just a man who knows what matters," he said. "That," she said, "is exactly what makes you the best." She reached up and kissed him there in the yard of the Bishop Callahan farm, with the spring wind in the grass, and the cattle moving in the south pasture, and the children's voices coming from the back of the house. And he held her with both arms and kissed her back with all the warmth and steadiness and deliberate presence that was the whole of who he was. They watched Pete and Willa walk down the road toward town together, and then they went inside to their family and their afternoon, and Willa kept the dime. And years later, when she was grown, she would tell her own children that she had gotten it for good luck from the kindest people she had ever known. Pete Haverford worked for the Bishop Callahan farm through that spring and into the summer, and proved so reliable and skilled that by the fall they had extended a more permanent arrangement. And by the following spring, Jedediah and Pete had grown the cattle operation to 35 head, and were beginning to talk about a partnership that would formalize what had already become an easy working relationship. Pete's situation stabilized and then improved, and Willa became part of the children's world in the easy way of children who find each other when the circumstances allow it. Clara turned 11 in the summer of 1880 and began helping Ruth with the bookkeeping for the farm in earnest, revealing a facility with numbers that surprised everyone, though perhaps it should not have, given her general disposition toward precision in all things. Henry turned 9 and had developed into a genuine help with the cattle, not just enthusiasm but real skill, and Jedediah watched him work sometimes with an expression of uncomplicated pride that made Ruth's heart turn over in her chest. Sam turned 5 and started school in September, and took to it with an intensity that delighted his teacher, Mrs. Pendleton, who told Ruth that Sam was one of the most focused pupils she had seen at that age, which anyone who had ever watched Sam supervise the garden harvest could have predicted. Elias began to walk in October, lurching between the furniture with the triumphant instability of a young person newly discovering upright locomotion, and the household adjusted itself to this development by becoming approximately twice as complicated, since Elias turned out to have the boldness of a child who has 4 older siblings to demonstrate to him that the world is interesting and accessible, and he was fully committed to accessing all of it immediately. Ruth and Jedediah stood in the kitchen doorway one November evening watching Elias negotiate the distance between the chair and the table, while Clara read to Sam at the table, and Henry came through the back door with mud on his boots, and an important observation about the south fence that needed relaying. And the house was full of all the ordinary particular noise of a family that has found its shape. And Ruth took Jedediah's hand where it rested against the door frame, and he looked down at her and she looked up at him. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she asked him this sometimes, not from doubt but from the genuine pleasure of hearing him answer. He looked at the room full of children and warmth and ordinary chaos, and then at her, and the answer was so plainly visible in his face before he even said it that she smiled before he spoke. "More than I knew to ask for," he said. "The years moved through the farm with the rhythm of work and season that is the structure of agricultural life. The herd grew. The farm grew." Ruth and Pete's wife, who had come from Topeka after Pete's situation improved enough to send for her, became friends with the uncomplicated ease of women who share the particular understanding of what it takes to keep a family alive and a household running. Ada Fenwick remained Ruth's closest friend and continued to take credit for the whole arrangement with the serene confidence of a woman who believes she arranged it, which was not entirely inaccurate. In the fall of 1881, Ruth discovered she was expecting again. She told Jedediah on a cool September evening on the porch, watching the last light on the grass. He was quiet for just a moment, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side and they sat together watching the light change. "A boy," he said. "I have no idea," she said. "God decides these things." "Either way," he said, and pressed his lips to her temple. Their daughter, Elena Ruth Bishop, was born in the late spring of 1882, in the same farmhouse, in the same bedroom, and she arrived with less urgency than her brother Elias and more composure, looking around the room with a focused, considering expression that Clara later said was the most like herself of any of the children at first sight. Clara was 13 by then and formally attached to all of the younger children with a fierce, competent love that was exactly her own way of doing everything. She helped with Elena the way she had helped Ruth with everything else, with complete reliability and the kind of quiet care that does not need to be thanked to continue. Henry, 11, was less interested in the baby and more interested in the cattle and the roping and the endless practical business of the farm, and spent most of his days outside in the productive, purposeful way of a boy who knows where he belongs. Sam, 6, going on 45, taught himself to read Elena a picture book by the time she was 6 months old, which was not effective at her developmental stage but very much satisfied Sam's sense of educational responsibility. Elias, 3, viewed Elena with the initial wariness of a dethroned youngest, and then with the sudden, total protectiveness of a child who has decided something is his to look after. Jedediah held Elena with the same quiet, complete care with which he held everything important, and Ruth watched him sitting in the chair by the window in the blue spring evening holding this newest person in their family, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a life becomes everything it was meant to be. The town of Colter's Creek grew through those years, as Kansas towns did, some of them. The railroad extended a spur line through the county in 1883, which changed everything about the market and the movement of cattle and the possibilities for what the Bishop Callahan farm could become. Jedediah had foreseen this possibility and had positioned the operation to take advantage of it, and by the summer of 1883 the farm was genuinely thriving by the standards of the valley, not wealthy, but stable and growing, a thing built by two people with good judgment and a willingness to work. The injustices of the world outside the farm pressed themselves inward sometimes, as they always did. The Osage people had been displaced from their lands further north, and the news of it came through the papers and through travelers on the trail, and Jedediah read about it with a quietness that Ruth had learned to read as anger held in careful check. He had ridden through Indian territory on the cattle drives and had known enough to understand what was being lost, though there was very little one rancher in one Kansas valley could do about the decisions made in Washington by men who had never seen the land they were legislating. He taught his children to see what was unjust and to say so, not to look away, and that was the thing he could give them. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that pressed on everything. The kitchen garden suffered. The cattle needed supplemental water, which required hauling. The sky went bright and white and empty for 7 weeks straight, and the grass went brittle, and the farmers of the valley gathered at the church on Sunday evenings to talk through what could be done and what could not. Jedediah came through it by making earlier and harder decisions than most, moving the cattle to the creek section before conditions made it necessary rather than after, and laying in water stores through July that they needed in August. They came through it. The Bishop Callahan farm came through the drought of 1884 with the herd intact, and the gardens partially recovered, and the family unharmed. And when the September rains finally came, Ruth stood in the yard in the rain with her face tilted up and her eyes closed, and Jedediah came and stood beside her, and then just stood there too with the rain on his face, because some things require simply standing in them. Clara was 16 in the summer of 1884, and she was becoming herself in the full sense of that becoming. A precise, capable, quietly passionate person who had decided that she wanted to be a school teacher, and who had been discussing this ambition with Ada Fenwick, and through Ada with the school board, with the focused determination that anyone who knew Clara could have predicted would eventually produce results. Ruth and Jedediah supported this completely, and were not surprised in any particular when the school board agreed to let Clara begin assisting Mrs. Pendleton in the fall, with the understanding that the following year she would have a class of her own. Henry was 14 and had become, in the practical day-to-day sense, Jedediah's right hand on the farm. He was tall and capable and still had the direct, uncomplicated enthusiasm for the work that he had always had, though it had matured into something more like genuine skill and less like boyish excitement. The conversations between them in the evenings, going over the next day's work or the state of the herd or the market prices coming from the railroad junction, were the conversations of equals in all practical ways, and Jedediah treated him as such. Sam was 9, and Sam was going to be either a teacher or a lawyer or possibly both, since he had discovered the pleasures of formal argument and applied them to every situation that arose, including, famously, a very extensive structured case for why supper should involve pie on weekday evenings, which he presented to Ruth with such technical thoroughness that she had to retreat to the kitchen to laugh where he could not see. Elias was 5, and the specific personality that had begun with the bold lurching walk had consolidated itself into a child who was, frankly, fearless in a way that gave Ruth constant low-level anxiety and Jedediah a constant low-level delight, because Elias reminded him of something he had once been and thought was gone. Eleanor was 2, and Eleanor was completely and utterly her own person, already, in the way of some children, a fact announced rather than discovered. On a warm September evening in 1884, after the drought had broken and the world felt clean and renewed, Jedediah and Ruth sat together on the porch in the old way, the children settled for the night, the sky doing something extraordinary with color in the west. Jedediah had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder, and the porch was familiar and solid under them. This porch he had helped build stronger the spring after they were married, this house that was properly theirs now, that had been rebuilt and repaired and filled over 6 years with the accumulated weight of a life genuinely lived in it. "I think about the day I rode in," he said. "Do you?" She smiled against his shoulder. "I had about $3 in my pocket and no particular plan," he said. "I thought I would stay a few weeks and move on." "What made you stay?" she asked, though she knew the answer, had always known it. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way he was quiet when he was being fully honest. "A woman on a porch with a baby on her hip who was the most beautiful, composed, completely about to fall apart person I had ever seen," he said. "I didn't know then what I was staying for. I just knew I was staying." She lifted her head and looked at him, and he looked back at her with everything he was entirely visible in his face, because he had learned over 6 years of her that this was safe. This was the one place in the whole world where he could be entirely seen, and it was safe. "I am very glad you stayed," she said. He leaned his forehead against hers. "I am very glad Sam dropped his hat," he said. She laughed and he kissed her, there on the porch in the September evening, and the stars were coming out above the prairie, and the grass was soft with recent rain, and inside the house 5 children were sleeping in the assorted, comfortable chaos of children who are entirely at home, and the farm spread around them in every direction, theirs, built, real and permanent. He had come in with nothing but a quiet horse and $3 and the long habit of moving on, and he had found the thing worth stopping for. And she had been holding everything together alone, managing, barely managing, and she had found the person who made the holding together into something that was not just survival but genuine, growing, daily joy. In the spring of 1885, Henry turned 15 and Pete Haverford's son came to work alongside him, and the Bishop Callahan farm hired its first permanent hand, and began in earnest the expansion that Jedediah and Pete had been planning through the winter, pushing the herd toward a number that would require a 3rd pasture section. Clara began her own classroom in April and was, according to Ada Fenwick, who kept meticulous social accounts, already the most popular teacher in the school, because she was demanding and fair in exactly equal measure. Sam began corresponding with a school in Wichita about the possibility of further education, because Sam's ambitions had always been horizontal, spreading outward in every direction, and the valley was not quite big enough for everything he intended to become. Ruth and Jedediah read his letters to the school and then looked at each other across the kitchen table and agreed that they would make it possible, whatever it took, which was the answer that parents give when a child has made something entirely right of themselves and deserves to go toward what they are. Elias at 6 was attending school with the concentrated ferocity of a child who suspects that information is useful and wants all of it immediately. And Alina at 3 was beginning to form sentences of a complexity and structural sophistication that made even Sam look thoughtful. Ruth stood one morning in the kitchen in April of 1885, looking out the window at the farm, and thought about the woman she had been 7 years before, standing at the edge of Harmon's general store porch with $9.70 owed and the world very narrow in every direction. She thought about the 14 months alone, the holding together, the managing. She thought about a boy and his hat, and a stranger on a bay horse with Winter Creek eyes who had picked up the hat from the dust without being asked. Jedediah came in from the morning work and went to the basin and washed his hands, and she watched him across the kitchen, this man who was entirely familiar now, who was the most known person in her world, and felt the same thing she had been feeling for 6 years, steady and certain and warm, as reliable as the rising of the sun. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, drying his hands, looking at her sideways with the particular attention he always gave her. "Good luck," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "You told Sam once," she said, "that the afternoon is always better than the morning, that things ahead always have the chance to be better." "I remember," he said. She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on his chest and looked up at him. "You were right," she said. "The afternoon was better. This is all so much better." He put his arms around her, solid and warm and completely certain. "Yes," he said against her hair, "it is." Outside the kitchen window the Bishop Callahan farm lay in the April morning, green from the recent rains, the cattle moving in the south pasture, the kitchen garden beginning to show its first green rows, the barn standing solid and well-roofed, the fence line running straight to the horizon. It was a good, real, permanent thing, built from nothing by two people who had chosen each other and chosen the work and chosen to keep choosing every single day. Inside the house, somewhere, Elias was attempting to convince Alina to climb something inadvisable, and Alina was saying no with the clarity and authority of a 3-year-old who knows her own mind. Sam's voice came from the front room, reading something aloud to himself with great intensity. The morning was full and ordinary and entirely theirs. Ruth Callahan Bishop, with her husband's arms around her and her farm outside the window and her children filling the house with their good noise, was, without question, the least likely and most complete kind of happy there is. The kind you do not plan for and did not know to ask for and find one morning when you are not looking, dropped like a coin in the dust, waiting to be picked up, waiting to be called what it is. Good luck and better than good luck, and everything the afternoon had ever promised it could be.